So I am going to talk to you, which is late this evening here on East Coast US time, on dynamic AWS security groups, and particularly in using Terraform and how we can do some fancy work with that. A little bit about myself as we start in. So I'm a senior architect at a federal contracting company called Blackstone Federal, and I've been in a lot of different roles in different industries, all in IT for a number of years. A while back, I learned about the DevOps movement as it was starting to take shape, and it really clicked, and I said I want to be a part of that, and started to head my career in that direction, and particularly in a way that I was coming back to being even more hands-on, as I enjoy, and that's part of why I refer to myself as a functioning architect, because I do still code quite a bit. All right, Blackstone Federal, as I said, is a premier engineering transformation agency, but it really is a good Washington Beltway is what that reference is, consulting company, and we do a lot of pretty cool technology work and agile transformation things for the U.S. federal government. And so we're actually making things happen. And we're always hiring. Quick disclaimer, because I do work for that and I do work for these security agencies, it need to just be clear that I'm not representing them. I am not demonstrating anything that we've developed specifically for client site. These are things we have done in our labs, and particularly even in my own lab, some of the stuff I'm going to show you tonight. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about security groups. We're going to what they are, how they're used, get into the alternative method that we've used in some cases, and how that can work, including then the Terraform example of how we can create security groups and assign them using a somewhat dynamic fashion. Okay, security groups, a lot of people know and understand these have been around AWS or the cloud for a while, but they're really a form of firewalls. They're the different bent in the traditional methods of single appliances in the way of other things. Very powerful, can be a good part of a security strategy. Some people set them very broadly like a traditional firewall, which doesn't totally take advantage of the capabilities. Other people would set them more specifically at resource level, such as even having like a security group special to every instance or every resource that they create. In my paths, when I talk about security and the use of things like that, is it two key principles are the minimal access, giving people least privilege, as it's also called, and there's never enough. No matter what you do with security, you haven't done enough, and there's always something else you could do to close those holes or to keep bad people out that are trying to figure out ways to get in. Okay, when people assigning a security group, I was saying a lot of times they put all the rules, the inbound, outbound rules specifically to a resource in a security group and put that on that machine. They might share that same security group with other like machines, so that there might be a web server security group, and all the web servers share the same one, which would be fine considering they're probably all doing the same thing and have the same needs. Sometimes that sharing goes a little bit farther out into potentially the whole environment, and then you end up with getting away from that minimalist attitude. So not a great idea. The rules and the way that you set them is that they can reference the IP addresses specifically. They can reference CIDR notations, things like that, so that you can restrict the access, saying only thing that can come in on this port and this protocol is from this location. Some of that can get into being kind of hard coded, especially if you're putting IP addresses and things in, then you're losing the ability to have dynamic IP, and you have other maintenance that goes into it. The CIDRs get a little closer to something that's probably going to stay the same within a VPC and that kind of thing. This lesser known reference, what we're going to talk about, which is that you can actually reference other security groups. And so you can have security groups only come from other security groups. Okay. Terraform does not particularly like to be dynamic. You know, there's a lot of great things about coding in Terraform, but there's things that it doesn't necessarily want to find out about at apply time, where you have created dynamic variables, lists and things like that. And a lot of people that have worked with it know what I'm talking about. They continue to make things better, and there's more ways to do that. A lot of times those errors don't show up until the apply state, which is more frustrating too. But there are some ways that you can do some dynamic things, and if you just do some trial and error and practice and understand how things work, you can actually get more reuse out of the code, have less repeat and hard coding, and that's also some of the things about this type of syntax, that it's not going to be as dry as you would like, especially for people like me that have come from heavy development backgrounds and are all about refactoring and things like that. Okay. The two tracks that we're going to go on now is basically looking at the alternate way to assign security group rules that are somewhat static, meaning that there's code specific to things going on, but yet kind of dynamically created, and then also a way to then assign those security groups to resources that is a little bit more reuse of code, more dynamic, but still has some static values to it. And we'll see what we mean as I get into that. We're almost getting into some code and things, but let's talk about the security group rules, get a feel for that. And the things we've been talking about here is about the standard use of the rules with IP addresses and CIDRs. This is an example of using the quad 0. And even AWS will warn you on the console when you have security groups like this. It's not a great idea. Use it a lot for debugging, but you don't necessarily even want your outside network open to the public, all of the public. And then you can also put in the IP range like we've talked about. And that's a good example where you could say everything in my network allows SSH from somewhere. The other alternative, using the security groups as the destinations, is that you can set up an example, and this is where a common use even in smaller applications is using like a server. Say we're building a database server, and so you would have the inbound ports and protocols open in a server security group, and it would reference a client security group. And then on the other side, the client security group would have the outbound ports and would only reference the server. And that makes this association that's only going to allow you to get across those groups like that. This is just a simple diagram of that with the security groups in the boxes in the middle, looking like walls. And the idea here is what I've just kind of described. But so if you're needing to get to your vault servers, because all of your web servers have some kind of secrets they need to retrieve when they spin up, the web servers are in the security group for the server, and the web servers are in the client security group that only knows about the server security group, and then vice versa. And what this gives you is then anything that is dropped into those groups will then assume the characteristics, and you don't have to build other security groups or do other ways to get around that. And it forces that association that only clients that have been authorized can get to the servers. And so as we add another web server into that, we just simply assign it to the same client security group, and then that's going to come over and automatically go to the have access to the servers. And the same way it works on the servers too. You have to expand that vault cluster, and you would be able to do that as well. Okay. The one part I was going to tell you about here before we get into some code is in AWS, they have limits of things that you can do, and there are default limits. And one drawback to this approach is that the default handling for security groups assumes you're using the other approach. And so the number of security groups that you can assign to an instance is limited to like 5, and the number of rules that each of those can contain is a higher number. You can get those limits changed, and that's what we've done in some cases just by a ticket request. And you can, as long as you stay within the math of the multiplication, it still works out. And so you can actually get more security groups that can be assigned to any one instance, but each one can contain lesser rules. So you get to kind of a 16 groups and 5 rules. If you're doing a lot of services, and some of the things that we've done in these big cloud platforms, you can still run into barriers, but you can combine security groups and not be totally server specific, that kind of thing. Okay, we're going to take a look at some code. Went a slide too far. Let's get out of that for a minute. And let's go into this. All right. So in how we build some things, and you might have seen or can go watch a talk that I did this past year at HashiConf, and I talked more about the cloud platforms and some of the techniques that we've used to build them. But this is where we have like a service layer, and there's different layers that would then make up an environment for a tenant in a multi-tenant environment. Won't go into a lot of that, but here in a sample of building a service like that, this service layer could be building out the security groups and then also other things related to the services that will be in that environment. You know, adding perhaps console mesh definitions and those kind of things. So here, in the variables that are passed in, we're going to pass in a map that is going to name these security groups, these services, and the clients and roles they have, and using a simple 1 and 0 nomenclature are going to say we want to create everything with a 1. In this case, simple case, we're going to be creating all of these service security groups. In the code that goes through that, the main thing here is that it's going to call this security group services module, and it's going to pass that hash into that, and then that's going to take care of all the magic to get into that. So let's go to that. Okay, before we get too far ahead here. Okay, so the security group services is this part of the module here, and just showing you here is what's in the magic is in this code is going to take apart that hash in these matches that are matching against these service role assignments. It's going to determine which ones have been selected. And so this is where this dynamic usage can come into play. So it's going to determine that, and then it's going to go into the security group loop, as we refer to it. And this one resource definition, using the count of everything that has come in to be created, is going to repeat and create all of those security groups. And so it's fairly dynamic there, a good reuse of that code, and goes through and does that. Okay. In the where things are a little bit more specific, a little bit more redundant coding, you're also getting into the security groups of like specifically the logging. And this is then where it's going to go through find out the information about the security groups that have been created, and it's going to separately create the rules specific to logging. And so it is going to call a module that knows about the logging service in particular. And so as you add a service, you'd have to add more modules to that. The logging rules would missing my, yeah, here we go. Actually has the code in there that is just creating resources that are security group rules. And you can see that the variety of this is that it's creating the service or server and client side of those. Everything is based on this count, which is basically knowledge of whether or not that security group was created in this pass. And it knows all the things that the logging server has to have open on both sides. And then the security group ID that was determined from the data statements previously for the security groups that were created are then the targets for those security group rules. And so we go through in this one pass and we make the server and the client side rules. This logging takes a lot of different things because of all the different connections it has to make places. And then we simply output the IDs for reference that's coming, that we have then created through that. So that all works pretty good. One piece that I was going to show you here is that it does actually do some prep to create the list of those things that are doing. And again, it's using these hash tables with the verbs for lookup. We were using matches and things before. We can also do lookups. It's basically deciding which ones have been created and which ones need the rules to be transferred for that. Okay. Let's go back. Nope, wait a minute. Yes, okay. We've been through that, through the rules. I have a little cheat sheet that I want to go by. And that looks pretty good. So let's get into that. We will actually try a live demo. And we'll see how that goes for us. So I just have a Linux machine here that I'm using. Part of things that I talked a little bit about in my other talk, but is that we like to put some wrapper scripts around the steps leading up to building a tenant environment. And so here I'm running those. We pump the variables in that describe the environment that we're creating. This is a TF lab, Terraform lab environment for a dynamic security group project. And we're going to go in and get that started. This doesn't talk a lot, but it's actually building from repos and assembling the code that will be used to build these layers that we're working on. And the layer that's named here is the service layer in the top of that screen over there. So it takes a minute where it pulls a lot of things together. Okay. So the next step we do is a setup step, and this actually is now going to deal with initializing the Terraform. And so this is initializing for the modules, initializing the back end. We're using an S3 back end, and the back end is specific to this particular tenant environment. And it goes through and either creates it or finds out it's already there, and then it will assign the workspace. So And there's a lot of other talks even going on in this 24-hour session about good workspace usage and things. Okay. So then we're getting a little closer to home, running a plan step now, which is going to build the plan for the service layer. Looks familiar to a lot of people. And so through that dynamic use of requesting which things need to be created and assembling everything that would need to go into there, it actually comes up with 27 things to do just for those 3 services, primarily because we are adding the security group rules independently. You can add them when you create security groups if you're not doing this, this kind of magic. So we're ready to apply that. And this goes through and very rapidly puts all that together and says, I'm done. So if we take a look here at our console, this is where the console was sitting about security groups before we ran that. If we do a refresh of this, we now see that these security groups have been created. We have the client and the server for each of the services that we requested. As we look at those and we look at the rules, we see that those rules have been created, and then importantly that the rules are associating to the server side. So that's the logging server side of that. They're going on there. Outbound has different rules for the client. It's a lot of times there's only inbound on one side and outbound on the other. Sometimes you need both. And so those have come into play, and everything is good there. We have a nice set of tags that we create because of standard tagging in the module world that we also had in there, you might have seen. And another thing I wanted to mention here too is that this mechanism works across VPC. So as long as you have a normal VPC peer, you can create a security group that references a security group in the other VPC. In the console side, it's not as obvious. You have to kind of type in it won't always list, auto list the other VPC, but in practice, it allows you to do that. And so through code, we can do that. So when we have a service platform as part of a cloud platform, you can add a tenant tier that, or environment that then connects to the services, and what you end up with is a set of client services all pointing to the same server, because each VPC ends up with its own client service that goes into that. Okay. Let's jump back into some code for the code lovers. I'm not going to show you everything here. We'll try to keep it a little higher level, but and we're not going to go through and build these machines, but this is an example of, here we have the code for the application layer that would then be creating, say, a DNS server, something else new like that, something that we previously would have created a service group for. And in that code, it's going to pass in its service role assignments, similar to how we did in the creation of the security groups. And in the variables, not those variables, in these variables, we're then saying this instance that I'm creating needs to be a logging client because it has to access the logging service. It's actually going to be the DNS server, so I need you to associate that to it. And then there's some other services like being able to have a bastion or jump server to get to it, all have to be put on when I build this. Now what happens is it goes through the code that builds the machine, puts it all together, and then it will, in the actual AWS instance verb, will put the list of security groups in that list. We'll take a quick look at how that happens. Going back over to some security group code and going into this assignment code. Once again, we see this use of match key statements, figuring out what has been requested as it's been passed up the list. And then this is going to go and get the information about all of those security groups by using a data request. And it's going to build a array or a list that is then going to be output back to the caller, and then in that instance create statement, it'll just simply supply this list, and then all of the security groups that were requested through those ones in the variables will be associated to the instance. And so we won't go through more of that or go through the build of that or anything. One last thing, since you've been so patient and bearing through that, I will just show that this is dynamic in the way that even as we go back now to destroy the environment and need to destroy those security groups, the dynamic nature of the code works where it can actually still figure out those things that have been created. And you notice that it does somewhat name these rules specific to the rules, but the security groups themselves are just coming out of the group loop, and they are instances of that. And that's part of where we're saying this is fairly reusable dynamic code. And if we apply that, it will go destroy the 27 items that were out there, and we'll be back to clean slate. And there we go. And we refresh on there, and voila, they are gone. Okay, that is what I had. I have a slide that says that's what I have. And finishing up. All right,